I'm standing in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug that's gone cold, staring at the thin wall that separates my apartment from what used to be his. The silence on the other side feels different now, heavier somehow, like the absence of something that was never quite there to begin with. 3 months since Henry Jackson moved out, and I'm still listening for sounds that will never come again. The morning light catches the small crack in the paint near the outlet, the one I noticed the day he first knocked. Not on my door, but on this wall between us. A tentative tap, tap, tap that made me freeze with my hand halfway to the light switch. I remember pressing my palm against the drywall, feeling foolish, wondering if he could sense me there on the other side. That was 2 years ago when I thought neighbors were just people who shared a building and nothing more. If you're watching this from your own apartment, your own kitchen, maybe with your own thin walls and careful distances, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if this story moves you at all, hit that hype button to help others find it too. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we're not alone in our quiet longings. The knock came on a Tuesday evening in October, when the radiator had just started its seasonal complaints and I was grading papers at my dining table. I'd been living in 4B for 6 months by then, settling into the rhythm of a life carefully constructed around solitude. Teaching high school English provided enough human interaction during the day that I could justify my evenings of silence, my weekends of books and takeout, and the kind of peace that comes from not having to explain yourself to anyone. But Henry Jackson changed that without even trying. He was holding a plate of cookies when I opened the door, still in his work clothes, tie loosened and sleeves rolled up in a way that made something flutter unexpectedly in my chest. Dark hair slightly mussed, eyes the color of coffee, a smile that seemed genuinely apologetic rather than performatively neighborly. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice had this quality, warm but not presuming, like he understood that some people guard their evening hours carefully. "I'm Henry, from 4A. I think I might have been making too much noise moving things around. I wanted to apologize and, well," he lifted the plate slightly. "My sister insisted I couldn't move into a new place without introducing myself properly to at least one neighbor. I should have taken the cookies, said thank you, maybe exchanged names and phone numbers for emergencies. Should have kept it simple, kept it safe. Instead, I found myself stepping back and saying, 'I'm Robert Murphy. I haven't heard any noise. But would you like to come in for coffee?'" The surprise on his face mirrored my own. I hadn't invited anyone into my apartment since I'd moved in. But there was something about the way he held himself, a carefulness that matched my own, that made me think maybe he understood the weight of small gestures. He accepted, and we spent 2 hours at my kitchen table talking about books and work and the peculiar intimacy of apartment living, how you learn the rhythms of strangers' lives through walls and shared hallways. He taught fourth grade, had moved here from Portland for a fresh start after what he called, with a wry smile, a relationship that taught me more about what I didn't want than what I did. I didn't ask for details. I was still learning then that the things we don't say can be just as revealing as the things we do. After he left that night, I stood in my kitchen listening to him move around his apartment, learning the geography of his evening routine. The soft thud of shoes being kicked off, the whistle of a kettle, the low murmur of what I assumed was a phone call. Ordinary sounds that shouldn't have felt intimate, but somehow did. That was the beginning of our careful friendship, built in the spaces between intention and accident. He would knock on the wall when he was making dinner. 2 quick taps that became our signal for want company. Sometimes I would tap back, and he would appear at my door with ingredients and stories from his classroom. Sometimes I would let the silence stretch, and he would respect it without question. We developed a language of small considerations. He would text before having friends over, not because I ever complained about noise, but because he'd noticed I kept my apartment quiet and wanted to give me warning. I would leave books I thought he might like outside his door, always with a note that said no rush to return, because I'd learned he was someone who felt the weight of obligations keenly. The months passed like this, a friendship that felt both natural and impossibly fragile. We would run into each other in the hallway and talk for 20 minutes about nothing important, both of us aware that we were standing closer than the conversation required. We would text about mundane things, grocery store recommendations, and weather complaints, messages that carried more weight than their content suggested. I told myself it was just loneliness, the way any friendship can feel charged when you've been alone for too long. I told myself the flutter in my chest when I heard his key in the lock next door was just the pleasure of having a good neighbor, someone who understood the unspoken rules of shared spaces. I was lying to myself, of course, but some lies feel safer than the truth, especially when the truth involves wanting something you've never let yourself want before. The first crack in my careful self-deception came on a Sunday in February when I got food poisoning from a questionable sushi place and spent the day alternating between my bed and bathroom, too miserable to even pretend I was fine. I must have made some noise because around noon there was a gentle knock on my actual door, not the wall. Henry stood in the hallway with a thermos of soup and a concerned expression that made my chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with nausea. "I heard you moving around and thought you might be sick," he said. "I made too much soup anyway." He stayed for an hour, not hovering but present, reading in my living room chair while I dozed on the couch. When I woke up, he had left the soup on my counter with a note that said, "Text if you need anything. I mean anything." I stared at that note for a long time after he left, at the careful emphasis on anything, and felt something shift inside me that I wasn't ready to name. The realization came slowly, then all at once, the way these things do. It was in the way I found myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, timing my own departures to increase the chances of running into him. It was in the way I started buying the brand of coffee he mentioned liking, just in case he came over. It was in the way I would catch myself staring at his hands when he gestured while talking, wondering what they would feel like. But mostly it was in the way I started to panic whenever I thought too hard about what any of it meant. I had never questioned my sexuality before, had dated women throughout college and my late 20s with what I thought was normal enthusiasm. But lying in bed at night, separated from Henry by nothing more than drywall and careful politeness, I found myself imagining conversations we'd never had, moments that crossed lines we'd never acknowledged existed. The panic would set in then, sharp and breathless. I would remind myself that I was 34 years old, too old for this kind of identity crisis. I would list all the reasons why whatever I was feeling was just confusion, just loneliness, just the result of spending too much time alone with my thoughts. But the wanting didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger, fed by every casual touch when he handed me something. Every moment when our conversation would pause and we'd look at each other just a beat too long before one of us would clear his throat and change the subject. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a restlessness I couldn't shake. Henry started leaving his windows open, and I could hear him more clearly through the wall, the soft strumming of a guitar I didn't know he played, the low rumble of his voice when he talked on the phone. Sometimes I would catch fragments of conversation, never enough to be intrusive, but sufficient to paint pictures of a life I wanted to know more about. One evening in April, I was grading papers when I heard him talking to someone, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, frustrated and tired. "I can't keep doing this, Nancy," he was saying, and I realized he was talking to his sister, the one who had insisted on the cookies. "I'm 32 years old. I can't keep pretending I'm something I'm not just because it's easier. I should have stopped listening, should have put on music or moved to another room. Instead, I found myself pressing closer to the wall, my heart hammering as his voice continued. "No, I haven't told him. How do I even begin that conversation? Hey, Robert, I know we've been friends for months, but I should mention I'm gay and also I think about kissing you approximately every time I see you. That seems like it might complicate things." The blood rushed so loudly in my ears that I almost missed Nancy's response, her voice too faint to make out words, but her tone clearly argumentative. "Because he's straight, Nancy. And even if he wasn't, he's not. He doesn't seem like someone who's looking for complications. He's careful, private. The last thing he needs is his neighbor developing feelings and making everything weird." I sat back from the wall, my hands shaking slightly. Henry was gay. Henry had feelings for me. Henry thought I was straight and careful and private, which I was, but not for the reasons he assumed. The conversation continued, but I couldn't process any more words. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall that suddenly felt both impossibly thick and paper thin, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about myself and about him. That night, I lay in bed listening to him move around his apartment, every sound now loaded with new meaning. The shower running late, the soft thud of what I now knew was a guitar being set aside, the creak of his bed as he settled in for sleep. Ordinary sounds that had become a soundtrack to my own confusion. I wanted to knock on the wall to somehow signal that I had heard him, that maybe we were both carrying the same secret weight. But I couldn't move, couldn't risk disrupting the careful balance we'd built, especially when I still didn't understand what any of it meant for me. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in careful avoidance disguised as normal behavior. I would still respond to his wall knocks, still accept his dinner invitations, still leave books outside his door. But now every interaction felt charged with the weight of what we weren't saying. I caught him looking at me sometimes when he thought I was distracted by cooking or reading. Quick glances that he would redirect as soon as I noticed, accompanied by a slight flush that made me want to reach across whatever space separated us and touch his face. But I didn't. I couldn't, because acknowledging what I was feeling would require acknowledging who I might be, and I wasn't ready for that conversation with myself, let alone with him. The tension built through May and into June, a slow accumulation of almost moments in careful distances. We would stand too close in my kitchen while cooking, both of us aware of the proximity but neither stepping away. We would text late into the night about books and movies, conversations that danced around the edges of something more personal without ever crossing the line. I started researching late at night when I couldn't sleep, reading articles and forums about sexuality and self-discovery and what it meant to realize something about yourself at 34 that other people figured out in high school. I learned terms like compulsory heterosexuality and late bloomer, and found myself nodding at descriptions of experiences I'd never had words for. But knowing the terms didn't make the reality any less terrifying. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late June, when Henry knocked on my door instead of the wall, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "I got a job offer," he said without preamble, "in Seattle. It's a good opportunity, exactly the kind of position I've been hoping for." I invited him in, my chest already tight with the implications. We sat at my kitchen table, the wine between us like a buffer against whatever conversation was coming. "When would you leave?" I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "End of August, if I take it." He poured wine for both of us, his movements careful and deliberate. "I haven't decided yet." We talked around the edges of it for an hour, discussing career opportunities and cost of living and the benefits of a fresh start. But underneath the practical considerations was a current of something else, a tension that had been building for months and was now demanding acknowledgement. Finally, Henry set down his wine glass and looked directly at me. "Can I ask you something, Robert?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Are you happy? I mean, really happy with your life the way it is?" The question caught me off guard, too broad and too specific at the same time. "I don't know," I said, which was more honest than I'd intended to be. "I thought I was, but lately I've been wondering if maybe I've been settling for safe instead of happy." He nodded slowly, like my answer confirmed something he'd been thinking. "I've been wondering the same thing. About myself, I mean, and about whether some risks are worth taking, even if they might change everything." We looked at each other across the small table, and I could feel the weight of all the things we'd never said pressing against the careful boundaries we'd maintained. The air felt thick with possibility and terror in equal measure. "Henry," I started, then stopped, not knowing how to finish the sentence. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know we've never talked about it, but I can't leave without at least acknowledging that there's something here, isn't there? Between us?" My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Yes," I said, the word barely more than a whisper. "There is." The relief on his face was immediate and overwhelming. He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and slightly trembling. "I've never," I started, then stopped again, struggling with how to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. "Neither have I," he said, though I suspected he meant something different than what I meant. Not like this. Not with someone who matters this much. We sat like that for a long moment, hands connected across the table, both of us breathing carefully like we were afraid sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile thing we'd just acknowledged. What does this mean? I asked finally. I don't know, Henry said, but I'd like to find out if you want to. What followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating month of my life. We moved slowly, carefully, like people learning a new language together. Henry would stay later after our walnut dinners, and we would sit on my couch talking about everything and nothing, gradually allowing ourselves to sit closer, to let our knees touch, to acknowledge the electricity that sparked every time we made contact. The first time he kissed me, we were washing dishes in my kitchen, standing side by side at the sink. He turned to say something about the movie we'd just watched, and suddenly we were looking at each other from inches away, and the space between us felt impossible to maintain. It was soft and tentative and completely overwhelming. When we broke apart, I was shaking. Is this okay? He asked, his hands gentle on my face. I think so, I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. I'm scared. Me too, he admitted. But good scared, I think. We took things slowly, spending hours just talking and kissing and learning the geography of this new territory we'd stumbled into together. Henry was patient with my uncertainty, never pushing for more than I was ready to give, always checking in to make sure I was okay. I was falling in love with him, I realized, not just with the idea of him or the novelty of these new feelings, but with who he was, the kindness and humor and careful attention he brought to everything he did. It should have been terrifying, and it was, but it was also the most natural thing in the world. We didn't talk about Seattle. The job offer sat between us like a ticking clock, but we both seemed determined to pretend we had all the time in the world to figure things out. But time, as it always does, ran out. The conversation came on a Sunday evening in early August, when we were lying on my couch, Henry's head on my chest, both of us drowsy and content in a way that felt almost dangerous in its perfection. I have to give them an answer by Friday, he said quietly, not looking at me. My chest tightened. What are you going to tell them? I don't know. He shifted so he could see my face. What do you want me to tell them? It was a fair question, but I didn't have a fair answer. What I wanted was for none of it to be happening, for us to exist in this bubble we'd created, where the only thing that mattered was learning how to be together. What I wanted was for him to stay, but I couldn't ask him to give up a career, opportunity for something I still wasn't sure I fully understood about myself. I want you to be happy, I said, which was true but not complete. That's not what I asked. I sat up, forcing him to do the same, needing distance to have this conversation. I can't ask you to stay, Henry. It wouldn't be fair. You've worked too hard to get to this point to pass up something like this. But what if I want to stay? What if this, he gestured between us, is worth more to me than any job? The hope in his voice nearly broke me. What if it's not? What if we try to build something here and it doesn't work out, and then you've given up Seattle for nothing? What if it does work out and I've given up the best thing that ever happened to me for a job? We stared at each other, both of us breathing hard, the weight of the decision pressing down like a physical thing. I need time to think, I said finally, knowing it was a coward's answer, but unable to offer anything else. Henry nodded, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. How much time? I don't know. He left that night without kissing me goodbye, and I spent the next 3 days in a state of anxious paralysis, going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind churned through every possible scenario. I called in sick on Wednesday and spent the day walking around the city, trying to sort through the tangle of fear and desire and uncertainty that had taken up residence in my chest. I found myself in the park where Henry had mentioned taking his students for field trips, sitting on a bench and watching families and couples move through their lives with what looked like such certainty. A woman with graying hair and kind eyes was sitting on the next bench, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. She noticed me watching and smiled. You look like someone with a lot on his mind, she said. Something like that, I admitted. My late husband used to say that the biggest regrets in life aren't the chances you take that don't work out. They're the chances you don't take at all. I thanked her and walked home, her words echoing in my head. But knowing what I should do and being brave enough to do it were two different things entirely. Thursday evening, Henry knocked on my door one last time. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well either. "I'm taking the child," he said without preamble. "I leave Sunday." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known they were coming. "Okay. I can't wait anymore, Robert. I can't keep hoping you'll figure out what you want while I put my life on hold." "I know," I said. "You're right." We stood in my doorway looking at each other, and I could see him waiting for me to say something that would change everything. To ask him to stay, to promise him something I wasn't sure I could deliver, to be brave enough to choose him over the safety of my carefully constructed solitude. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat, trapped behind years of conditioning and fear, and the terrible certainty that I would somehow ruin the best thing that had ever happened to me. "I love you," Henry said quietly. "I know that probably makes this harder, but I needed you to know." "I love you too," I whispered, the words barely audible but true. So true it felt like they might tear me apart. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Take care of yourself, Robert." And then he was gone, and I was standing in my doorway listening to him pack through the wall, the sounds of a life being dismantled and prepared for transport. I wanted to knock, to tell him I'd changed my mind, that I was ready to be brave, but I couldn't move, couldn't risk disrupting his decision now that he'd finally made it. He left early Sunday morning. I heard him loading boxes into what I assumed was a moving truck, heard voices in the hallway as friends helped him carry furniture. I stayed in my apartment, too cowardly to even say goodbye properly, and listened to the sounds of his departure. The silence that followed was different from any silence I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable solitude I'd cultivated for years, but a hollow absence that seemed to echo in every room of my apartment. The first few weeks after Henry left were a study in the difference between being alone and being lonely. I had been alone for most of my adult life, had built a careful existence around solitude and self-sufficiency. But loneliness was something else entirely, a constant ache that colored everything I did. I would catch myself listening for sounds from 4A, forgetting for moments that it was empty now, that there was no one to knock on the wall for dinner invitations or late-night conversations. The new tenant who moved in at the end of August was a graduate student named Joyce Gray, who kept odd hours and played music I didn't recognize. She was perfectly pleasant when we passed in the hallway, but she might as well have been living on another planet for all the connection I felt to her presence. I threw myself into work, volunteering for extra committees and taking on additional classes, anything to fill the hours that had previously been occupied by Henry's company. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting on my increased dedication with a mixture of approval and concern. "You're working too hard, Robert," Deborah Lee said one afternoon, finding me in my classroom at 6 p.m. grading papers that could have waited until the weekend. "When's the last time you did something just for fun?" I couldn't remember. Fun had become something I associated with Henry, with the easy laughter we'd shared over dinner preparation and the comfortable silences during movie nights. Without him, entertainment felt hollow, like going through the motions of a life rather than actually living one. I started seeing a therapist in September, partly because the loneliness was becoming unbearable, and partly because I knew I needed help sorting through the identity questions that Henry's presence in my life had raised. Dr. Alexander Cox was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in sexuality and relationships, and he had the kind of patient demeanor that made it easier to talk about things I'd never said out loud before. "It sounds like Henry was a catalyst for you," he said during one of our early sessions. "Someone who helped you recognize feelings and desires you'd been suppressing." "But what if those feelings were just about him specifically?" I asked. "What if I'm not actually gay, just confused by a particular relationship?" "What would it mean if you were gay?" he asked in return, which was exactly the kind of question I'd been afraid he would ask. The honest answer was that it would mean everything I thought I knew about myself was incomplete, that I'd spent 34 years living a life that was only partially true. It would mean that all those relationships with women, while not false exactly, had been missing something essential. It would mean that I'd let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away because I was too scared to embrace who I really was. "It would mean I made a terrible mistake," I said finally. Dr. Cox nodded. And what would it mean if you weren't gay? If these feelings were specific to Henry, it would mean I lost someone I loved because I couldn't figure out what I wanted fast enough. So either way, you are dealing with loss. Either way, I'm dealing with regret. October arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible, and I found myself thinking about Henry constantly. I wondered if Seattle was everything he'd hoped it would be, if he was happy in his new job, if he'd met someone who could give him the certainty I'd been unable to provide. I started writing him letters I never sent, long rambling things where I tried to explain everything I'd been too scared to say when he was still here. I wrote about the therapy sessions and the slow process of understanding myself, about the way I'd been replaying every moment we'd shared and seeing them differently now. I wrote about missing him with an intensity that surprised me, about waking up every morning and remembering all over again that he was gone. But I never sent any of them. What was the point? He'd moved on, started a new life, and I had no right to disrupt that with my belated self-discovery. The breakthrough, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Thursday evening in late October, exactly a year after Henry had first knocked on my door with cookies and an apology. I was grading papers and half listening to music when a song came on that he'd played for me once, something soft and acoustic that had been playing in the background during one of our movie nights. The memory hit me with unexpected force. Not just the song, but the whole evening. The way we'd been sitting, close enough to touch. The way he'd looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The careful way we'd both been pretending that the electricity between us was just friendship. And suddenly I understood, with a clarity that felt like waking up from a long dream, that I hadn't been confused about my sexuality at all. I'd been in love with Henry Jackson, completely and entirely, and the fact that he was a man wasn't an obstacle to overcome or a complication to figure out. It was just part of who he was, part of what I loved about him. I was gay, or bisexual, or some other word that meant I was capable of falling in love with men as well as women. The specific label mattered less than the recognition, the sudden understanding that this part of myself had always been there, waiting for the right person to help me see it clearly. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by a grief so sharp it took my breath away. I had figured it out too late. Henry was gone, building a life in Seattle, and I was sitting alone in my kitchen, finally understanding what I'd lost. I called Dr. Cox the next morning and made an emergency appointment. I think I know who I am now, I told him, but I don't know what to do with that information. What do you want to do with it? I want to call Henry. I want to tell him I figured it out, that I love him, and I'm sorry I was too scared to say it when it mattered. What's stopping you? It's been 3 months. He's probably moved on. And even if he hasn't, what right do I have to disrupt his life now? He made a decision to leave, to start over, and I can't ask him to give that up just because I finally got my act together. Dr. Cox was quiet for a long moment. Robert, can I ask you something? Of course. If Henry called you tomorrow and said he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to come back and try again, what would you say? The answer was immediate and certain. I'd say yes. I'd say I'm sorry for being so scared and yes, let's try again. Then don't you think he deserves the chance to make that choice for himself? I spent the weekend crafting and recrafting a text message to Henry, trying to find words that would convey everything I needed to say without putting pressure on him to respond in any particular way. In the end, I settled for something simple. I know it's been 3 months, and I know you've moved on with your life, but I wanted you to know that I figured it out, about myself, about us. I love you, and I'm sorry I was too scared to say it when it mattered. You don't need to respond to this. I just needed you to know. I stared at the message for 20 minutes before finally hitting send, then immediately regretted it. What if he deleted my number? What if he was seeing someone else? What if my message just reopened wounds that had finally started to heal? But it was too late to take it back, so I put my phone in a drawer and tried to distract myself with household, chores, and lesson planning, and anything else that might keep my mind occupied. He called 6 hours later. Robert? His voice sounded exactly the same, warm and careful and slightly uncertain. Hi, I said, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear my own voice. I got your message. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have sent it. I just don't apologize, he interrupted. I'm glad you did. I've been thinking about you constantly since I left. About us. How's Seattle, Lidau? I asked, not sure I was ready for whatever he might say next. Beautiful. The job is great, exactly what I hoped it would be. I have a nice apartment. I've made some friends. I'm building the kind of life I always thought I wanted. My heart sank. That's wonderful. I'm happy for you. But I'm not happy, Robert. I thought I would be. Thought that getting away from the situation would help me move on. But it hasn't. I think about you every day. I wonder what you're doing, whether you're okay, whether you ever think about me, too. Every day, I admitted. I think about you every day. I miss you, he said quietly. I miss our dinners and our conversations and the way you would leave books outside my door. I miss the sound of you moving around your apartment. I even miss that terrible coffee you used to make. I laughed despite myself. It wasn't that terrible. It was pretty terrible, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But I'd drink it every day for the rest of my life if it meant getting to sit in your kitchen and talk about books with you. We talked for 2 hours, catching up on the months we'd missed, sharing the small details of our separate lives. He told me about his students and his new apartment and the hiking trails he'd discovered. I told him about therapy and the slow process of understanding myself and the way I'd been writing him letters I never sent. What did the letter say? He asked. That I love you, that I'm sorry, that I finally figured out who I am, and it turns out I'm someone who falls in love with men. With you, specifically. There was a long pause. Are you sure? I mean, I know this is all new for you, and I don't want you to feel pressured to. I'm sure, I said, cutting him off. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Another pause. So what do we do now? It was a fair question, and I didn't have a complete answer. I don't know. You have a life there now, a job you love. I can't ask you to give that up. What if you didn't have to ask? What if I wanted to come back? My breath caught. Do you? I've been thinking about it for weeks. My contract here is only for 1 year, and there are teaching positions in your city. I could apply for next fall, see if anything opens up. That's 8 months away. I know, but maybe we could figure out how to make it work in the meantime. Visits, phone calls, whatever it takes. I close my eyes, hardly daring to hope. Are you sure? I don't want you to make another life-changing decision because of me if you're not certain. Robert, he said, and his voice was steadier than I'd ever heard it. I've spent 3 months trying to convince myself that leaving was the right choice, that I was better off starting fresh somewhere new. But the truth is I left because I was scared too. Scared that you'd never figure out what you wanted. Scared that I'd keep waiting forever for something that might never happen. And now I think we're both scared, but maybe we can be scared together. Maybe that's better than being scared apart. We talked every day after that, long conversations that stretched late into the night, slowly rebuilding the connection we'd lost. Henry sent me pictures of Seattle, the mountains and water, and the coffee shop where he'd been spending his weekends. I sent him pictures of the books I was reading, the meals I was cooking, the small changes I'd made to my apartment that somehow felt like preparations for a different kind of life. We made plans for him to visit in December during his winter break. It felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly soon, this prospect of seeing each other again after everything that had changed. I spent weeks preparing for his visit, cleaning my apartment obsessively, stocking the kitchen with all his favorite foods, trying to create an environment that would feel welcoming rather than desperate. But when he finally knocked on my door on a Friday evening in mid-December, all my careful preparations felt irrelevant. He looked exactly the same and completely different. Familiar but somehow more himself, like the distance had given him a clarity he hadn't possessed before. We stood in my doorway looking at each other for a long moment, both of us uncertain about the etiquette of this reunion. "Hi," I said finally. "Hi," he replied. And then we were hugging, careful at first, and then with increasing intensity, months of separation and longing compressed into a single embrace. The weekend was a revelation. We moved around each other in my apartment with an ease that surprised us both. falling back into old rhythms while acknowledging the new understanding between us. We cooked together, talked for hours, kissed with a freedom that had been absent during our careful exploration the previous summer. But more than that, we talked honestly about what we wanted, what we were willing to risk, what kind of future we could imagine building together. Henry had already started looking at job postings in the city, and while nothing was guaranteed, the possibility felt real in a way it hadn't before. I want to try, I told him on Sunday morning, as we sat in my kitchen sharing coffee and the newspaper. I want to try to make this work, whatever it takes. Even if it means long distance for a while, even if it's complicated and uncertain, especially then, I said. I spent too many years choosing safe over happy. I don't want to make that mistake again. He flew back to Seattle that afternoon, but this time the separation felt different, temporary rather than final. We had a plan now, tentative but real, and the knowledge that we were working toward the same future made the distance bearable. The months that followed were challenging but hopeful. We video called every evening, sent each other care packages, planned visits around school breaks and long weekends. Henry applied for several positions in the city, and while the job market was competitive, his experience and references made him a strong candidate. In March, he got an interview at a school just 20 minutes from my apartment. In April, they offered him the position. It's not as prestigious as the Seattle job, he told me over the phone, his voice carefully neutral. The salary is lower, and the benefits aren't as good. But, I prompted, hearing the excitement he was trying to contain, but it would mean being in the same city as you. It would mean we could try this properly, without the distance and the uncertainty. What do you want to do? I want to come home, he said, if you'll have me. Henry moved back to the city in June, not to apartment 4A, which had been rented to someone else, but to a place 6 blocks away that we found together. A one-bedroom with good light and thin walls that reminded us both of where we'd started. We spent the summer learning how to be together in the same city again, navigating the difference between the relationship we'd built over phone calls and video chats and the reality of daily proximity. It wasn't always easy. We both had habits and expectations that needed adjusting, and there were moments when the weight of everything we'd been through felt overwhelming. But we were both committed to making it work, to building something real and lasting from the foundation of friendship and longing we'd established. I came out to my family and colleagues gradually, carefully, starting with the people I trusted most and working outward. The responses varied from enthusiastic support to polite confusion to awkward silence, but none of it felt as catastrophic as I'd feared. Dr. Cox helped me process the more difficult reactions, reminding me that other people's discomfort with my truth didn't make it less valid. Henry and I moved in together in September, exactly 2 years after he'd first knocked on my door with cookies and an apology. We chose a place with thick walls and good soundproofing, joking that we'd learned our lesson about the intimacy of shared spaces. But sometimes late at night, I missed the way we used to communicate through drywall, the careful taps and whispered conversations that had been the beginning of everything. Now, standing in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October, watching Henry make coffee with the same careful attention he brings to everything he does, I think about the long journey that brought us here, the months of careful friendship, the slow recognition of something deeper, the fear that nearly cost us everything, and the courage it took to try again. We're not the same people who lived on opposite sides of a thin wall, learning each other's rhythms through shared spaces and unspoken longings. We've both changed, grown into versions of ourselves that are braver and more honest and more willing to risk comfort for the possibility of real happiness. But some things remain the same. The way Henry hums under his breath when he's concentrating, the way he leaves books for me to find, still with notes that say no rush to return, the way we can sit in comfortable silence, both reading, both aware of the other's presence in a way that feels like the most natural thing in the world. What are you thinking about, he asked, noticing my contemplative mood. Just remembering, and I say, the wall, the way we used to knock. He smiles, the same smile that made something flutter in my chest that first evening when he appeared at my door with cookies and good intentions. We could knock on this wall, he suggests, gesturing toward the kitchen wall that separates us from our neighbors. See if anyone knocks back. I think I'm done with walls, I tell him, moving closer, close enough to touch his face, to kiss him good morning in our own kitchen, in the life we've built together. I prefer direct communication now. He laughs, pulling me closer, and I think about how strange and wonderful it is that the best things in life often begin with the smallest gestures. A knock on a wall, a plate of cookies. The courage to acknowledge that sometimes the person you're looking for has been right there all along, separated by nothing more than fear and the assumption that love always looks the way you expect it to. We were just neighbors sharing a wall, and somehow we built a life on the other side of it. Not the life either of us had planned, but the life we both needed, the one that was waiting for us to be brave enough to reach for it.